The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sophie Chen's design studio in Manhattan, casting warm light across her latest project sketches. At 32, she had finally built the life she'd dreamed of since childhood. Her boutique firm, Innovative Spaces, had just won 3 major awards for sustainable architecture, and her team had grown from 2 people working out of her apartment to 15 talented designers in a stylish office overlooking Central Park. Running her fingers through her shoulder-length black hair, Sophie smiled at the memory of those early days after the divorce. She'd been broken then, barely able to get out of bed some mornings, but piece by piece she'd rebuilt herself. The pain of losing both her marriage and their unborn child had nearly destroyed her, yet somehow she found the strength to channel her grief into her work. "Ms. Chen, your 10 o'clock appointment is here," Amy, her assistant, called through the intercom. Sophie glanced at her watch, surprised. She'd been so absorbed in her sketches she'd lost track of time. "Send them in, please." Sophie stood, smoothing her navy blue dress. She'd been excited about this meeting. A major tech company wanting to build an eco-friendly headquarters could be exactly the kind of project her firm needed to reach the next level. The door opened and Sophie's heart stopped. Time seemed to freeze as she stared at the man walking into her office. James Barrett, her ex-husband. The last time she'd seen him had been in their divorce lawyer's office 5 years ago, but he still had the same effect on her, like all the oxygen had been sucked from the room. He'd changed though. The once perfectly styled hair now had touches of gray at the temples and fine lines crinkled around his eyes. His expensive suit couldn't hide that he'd lost weight. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that used to look right through her when he was lost in his work, now fixed on her with an intensity that made her hands tremble. "Hello, Sophie," he said softly, his voice carrying the slight Australian accent that had first charmed her at that coffee shop 8 years ago. "You look wonderful." Sophie gripped the edge of her desk, grateful for its solid support. "What are you doing here, James?" She was proud that her voice remained steady, professional. "Officially? I'm here because Barrett Tech needs the best sustainable design firm in New York for our new headquarters." He took a step forward, then seemed to think better of it. "Unofficially, I've spent 5 years trying to become someone worthy of asking for your forgiveness." A bitter laugh escaped before Sophie could stop it. "Forgiveness? You mean for working 100-hour weeks while I lost our baby? Or for getting emotionally involved with your co-founder while I was grieving alone?" James flinched as if she'd slapped him. "I deserve that. I deserve worse. I was a fool who thought building a successful company would somehow make me worthy of you. Instead, I lost the only thing that really mattered." Sophie walked to the windows, needing distance from his presence. The city stretched out below, reminding her of how far she'd come. "Why now, James? Barrett Tech is worth billions. You've won. Isn't that what you always wanted?" "I wanted to come back sooner," he said quietly. "But my therapist helped me understand I needed to fix myself first. To understand why I always put work before love, why I was so afraid of emotional intimacy that I pushed away the one person who truly loved me." Sophie turned, surprised. The James she'd known would rather have died than admit to seeing a therapist. He'd always insisted he could handle everything himself. "I've changed, Sophie. I know those are just words, and you have no reason to believe them. That's why I'm here as a client first. Work with me on this project. See for yourself who I am now." He placed a thick folder on her desk. "These are the preliminary plans. We want to build something revolutionary, a completely sustainable tech campus that could change how corporate buildings are designed. Your vision, your terms. If you decide you never want to see me again afterward, I'll respect that." Sophie's mind raced. This project could establish her firm internationally. She'd be a fool to turn it down just because of their history. But could she trust herself to work with him? To see him regularly without reopening old wounds? "Your co-founder won't mind." The words came out sharper than intended. James' expression softened with understanding. "Lisa left the company 3 years ago. The truth about what happened between us, it's not what you think. But that's a conversation for another time, if you're ever willing to hear it." Sophie walked back to her desk, drawing strength from the space she'd created for herself. Beautiful, sustainable, and completely her own. Could she risk letting James back into her carefully constructed world? I'll need to review the plans with my team, she said finally, keeping her voice professional. We'll have an answer for you by the end of the week. James nodded, accepting her terms. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn notebook. I understand. But before I go, I've written in this every day since you left. About my mistakes, my regrets, my journey to become better. It's yours if you want it. He placed it beside the folder. Whether you take the project or not, I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, Sophie. I just didn't know how to love you right. He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. You've built something amazing here. I always knew you would. Then he was gone, leaving Sophie staring at the notebook that held 5 years of his thoughts. She sank into her chair, her hands shaking as she reached for the notebook. Outside her office, New York continued its busy morning, unaware that Sophie Chen's carefully reconstructed world had just been turned upside down by the man who'd once shattered it. Sophie sat in her favorite corner of the small coffee shop near her office, James's notebook untouched on the table before her. She'd carried it around for 3 days, unable to open it yet equally unable to throw it away. The morning rush had passed, leaving the cafe quiet except for the gentle hum of conversation and the whir of the espresso machine. You look like you need something stronger than coffee, said Diana, sliding into the seat across from her. Sophie's best friend since college pushed a chocolate croissant across the table. Eat, then tell me why you've been avoiding my calls. Sophie picked at the pastry, the buttery layers flaking under her fingers. James came to my office. Diana's warm brown eyes widened. James? As in workaholic broke your heart, James. He wants to hire my firm for Barrett Tech's new headquarters. Sophie took a sip of her now lukewarm coffee, and he gave me this. She tapped the notebook. Have you read it? I can't. Sophie's voice cracked. Every time I try, I remember that day at the hospital. Lying there alone, losing our baby, while he was in Singapore closing some deal. When he finally showed up 2 days later, he brought his laptop to the hospital room. He was on calls while I was signing discharge papers. Diana reached across the table, squeezing her hand. You don't owe him anything, sweetie. Not your time, not your forgiveness, nothing. I know. Sophie pulled her hand back, wrapping her arms around herself. But the project, Diana, it's exactly what I've dreamed of doing. A chance to prove that sustainable architecture can work on a massive scale. My designs could influence how companies build for decades. And that's the only reason you're considering it? Diana's tone was gentle but knowing. Sophie stared out the window, watching people hurry past. He's different. When he came to my office, he talked about therapy. The James I knew would rather have died than admit he needed help. She turned back to her friend. But then I remember how it felt, those last months of our marriage. Coming home to an empty house every night. Finding text messages from Lisa on his phone at 3 a.m. just work stuff, he'd say. Then I found out she'd been in love with him for months, and he'd done nothing to stop her flirting. What exactly did he say about that? That the truth wasn't what I thought. But isn't that what they all say? Sophie pulled out her phone, opening the Barrett Tech website. James's corporate photo stared back at her, the perfect CEO in his perfect suit. Look at him, 37 years old and worth billions. He has everything he ever wanted. Except you, Diana pointed out. And from what you've told me, Lisa's not around either. Sophie closed the website. She left the company 3 years ago, apparently. But that's not the point. How can I work with him when every time I see him, I'll remember walking into that board meeting? The memory hit her like it was yesterday. She'd gone to surprise James with lunch, hoping to reconnect. Instead, she'd found Lisa standing too close to him, laughing at something on his phone, a hand on his arm. The way James had jumped away from her, guilt flashing across his face, it had confirmed every suspicion Sophie had been trying to ignore. You filed for divorce the next day, Diana reminded her softly. He didn't even fight it. Sophie blinked back tears, just signed the papers and buried himself in work. The day it was finalized, Barrett Tech's stock hit an all-time high. Guess he was celebrating. And now he shows up with a notebook full of 5 years' worth of thoughts. Diana shook her head. That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most manipulative. That's just it. I can't tell which. Sophie finally picked up the notebook, running her thumb along its worn edges. The James I married would never have kept a journal. He used to say feelings were a waste of time that could be spent building the company. Maybe he really has changed. Maybe. Sophie opened her bag, pulling out Barrett Tech's project proposal. The headquarters design. It's incredible, Diana. They want to build something that could revolutionize corporate architecture. Zero carbon footprint, complete energy independence, living walls that could help clean the city's air. It's like they took every idea I've ever talked about and said, dream bigger. You think he designed it for you? I think he remembered everything I ever said about sustainable design, even when I thought he wasn't listening. Sophie closed the folder, her decision crystallizing. I'm going to take the project. Diana raised an eyebrow. You sure about this? No. Sophie managed a small smile. But I've spent 5 years building myself into someone stronger. If I turn this down because I'm afraid of dealing with my past, what was it all for? She picked up the notebook, finally ready to open it. Besides, I need to know the truth about Lisa, about why he really let me go. Even if it hurts, not knowing has been worse. Just promise me you'll be careful, Diana said, concern etching her features. Your heart's too precious to break twice. Sophie nodded, her fingers tracing the first page of James's journal. I'm not the same girl he left behind. This time, if anyone's heart gets broken, it won't be mine. But as she began to read his first entry, dated the day she'd moved out of their home, she wondered if she was lying to herself, and if some hearts were meant to be broken more than once before they could heal properly. The Barrett Tech project room buzzed with energy as Sophie's team presented their initial concepts. She stood at the back, watching James's reactions as each designer walked through their ideas. 2 weeks into the project, and she still couldn't quite believe she was here, working with him again. He'd changed his coffee order, she noticed absently. The man who used to drink straight black coffee now cradled a cup of green tea, nodding thoughtfully as Ryan, her youngest designer, explained the living wall concept. The old James would have been checking his phone every 30 seconds. This one hadn't touched it once. The vertical gardens won't just look beautiful, Ryan explained, pulling up the 3D renderings. They'll help purify the air and reduce the building's carbon footprint. We're thinking of incorporating a community garden on the roof too. Like the one you always wanted for our house, James said quietly, glancing at Sophie. She tensed, surprised he remembered that conversation from their first year of marriage. They'd been house hunting, and she dreamed out loud about growing their own vegetables, teaching their future children about nature. The rooftop design is still in development, Sophie cut in, keeping her voice professional. We'll have detailed plans next week. After the meeting, Sophie gathered her papers quickly, hoping to escape before James could catch her alone. She'd been carefully maintaining boundaries, keeping their interactions strictly professional. It was easier that way, safer. Sophie. His voice stopped her at the door. Do you have a minute? She turned, finding him still seated at the conference table, looking somehow vulnerable despite his expensive suit. I have another meeting. Please? He gestured to the chair beside him. Just 5 minutes. Against her better judgment, she sat. The project room felt different now that they were alone, more intimate somehow. Through the glass walls, she could see her team heading out for lunch, their excited chatter muted by the thick glass. The designs are incredible, he said, running a hand through his hair. A nervous gesture she remembered all too well. Exactly what I hoped for when I came to your firm. Is that all you wanted to tell me? No. He pulled something from his briefcase, a faded blue blueprint, carefully preserved. I found this when I was cleaning out my old office files. Remember it? Sophie's breath caught. It was her first design, sketched out on their honeymoon in Bali. They'd been lying on the beach, and she described her dream project. A building that worked with nature instead of against it. He'd run to the hotel gift shop for paper, insisting she draw it before she forgot the details. You kept this? Her fingers hovered over the paper, not quite touching it. I kept everything. His voice was soft. Every sketch you ever showed me, every article about sustainable architecture you marked for me to read, even when I was too busy to look at them. He pushed the blueprint toward her. It belongs to you. James. She started to refuse, but he shook his head. I know I've lost the right to say this, but I'm proud of you, Sophie. What you've built here, what you're creating, it's extraordinary. And I'm not just talking about the designs. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. I had to build something. after everything fell apart. I know. He looked down at his hands. I've read your interviews, seen your TED Talk about sustainable design. You've become everything you dreamed of being. While I became a billionaire, the words came out more bitter than she intended. Became empty. He met her eyes. All that success, and I couldn't even enjoy it because every time something good happened, I wanted to tell you first. Do you know I still pick up my phone to call you whenever Barrett Tech stock hits a new high? Sophie stood abruptly, needing space. Don't. Please don't do this. I'm not trying to pressure you. He stayed seated, giving her the distance she needed. I see how carefully you maintain boundaries with me, how professional you keep everything. And you're right to do it, but I need you to know that I see you, Sophie. I see how amazing you've become, and I hate that I wasn't there to watch it happen. You chose not to be. She turned to face him. Every time I needed you, you chose work instead. Even when. She stopped, the old pain rising in her throat. Even when we lost the baby, he finished quietly. I know. I ran away into work because I didn't know how to handle the pain, or how to help you with yours. I was a coward. Through the glass walls, Sophie could see her team returning from lunch, laughing together. She'd built not just a firm, but a family here. People who supported each other, who showed up when it mattered. I have to go, she said, gathering her things. We'll have the revised plans ready next week. Sophie, his voice stopped her again at the door. Thank you for giving this project a chance. Even if that's all you ever give me, it's more than I deserve. She didn't turn around, but her hand tightened on the doorknob. You know what the hardest part is? Sometimes I look at you now, and I see glimpses of the man I fell in love with. The one who used to bring me coffee in bed and listen to me ramble about sustainable architecture for hours. But then I remember how that man disappeared, and I'm afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid that if I let myself believe in this version of you, you'll disappear again too. She pushed open the door, leaving him alone with her words hanging in the air between them. It wasn't until she reached her office that she realized she was still holding the old blueprint, his first gift to her dreams when they were young and thought love could conquer anything, even ambition. Sophie stared at her phone in disbelief, the news notification making her heart race. Rival tech giant attempts hostile takeover of Barrett Tech. She'd just finished a late-night design session at the office, and now her screen was flooded with breaking news alerts about James's company. Her finger hovered over his contact. She'd never deleted his number, just moved it to the bottom of her list. Before she could decide whether to call, her office door flew open. James stood there, his tie loose and hair disheveled, looking nothing like the polished CEO she'd grown used to seeing again. I'm sorry to burst in, he said, slightly out of breath, but I needed to tell you in person, the project isn't cancelled. No matter what happens with this takeover attempt, your firm's contract is safe. Sophie set her phone down slowly. That's what you're worried about right now? Your company is under attack, and you came here to tell me about our contract. He dropped into the chair across from her desk, a tired laugh escaping him. 5 years ago, I would have been locked in my office, making calls, fighting back without sleeping for days. He rubbed his face. Now all I could think was I need to make sure Sophie knows she's not losing this opportunity. James. She didn't know what to say. The old James would indeed have disappeared into work, emerging weeks later with victory and without apology. They're trying to take everything I built, he said quietly. Global Tech wants to strip Barrett Tech for parts, fire half the staff, sell off our green energy division, turn us into just another serverless tech corporation. Sophie found herself walking around her desk, sitting in the chair next to his. What are you going to do? Fight them, of course, but not like I would have before. He turned to face her. You know what scared me most when I got the news? Not losing the company. I was terrified I'd fall back into old patterns, that I'd become that workaholic who lost you again. The vulnerability in his voice made her chest tight. You're not that person anymore. No. He gave a hollow laugh. The board wants me to cancel all non-essential projects to free up capital for the fight. Your friend Diana's article about our sustainable headquarters hit the business pages this morning. Global Tech's CEO called it a wasteful vanity project. Sophie felt her face flush with anger. The article had been beautiful. Diana had captured every detail of their vision for a building that could change corporate architecture forever. So what did you tell the board? That they can take their suggestion and shove it. A ghost of his old grin appeared. I told them this building isn't just a project, it's the future of Barrett Tech. It's proof that companies can make money without destroying the planet. He paused, looking at her intently. It's also my chance to show someone very important to me that people really can change. Sophie stood abruptly, walking to her wall of awards. She needed distance from the warmth in his eyes. Why did you really come here tonight, James? Because I'm scared. The raw honesty in his voice made her turn around. Not of losing the company. I'm scared of losing myself again. When I got the news, my first instinct was to grab my laptop and disappear into work. But then I thought about what my therapist would say, about how running from emotions was what cost me everything that mattered. So instead you came here? He nodded. I needed to be somewhere that reminded me of who I'm trying to be, not who I was. He glanced around her office, taking in the Sustainable Design Awards, the wall of successful projects. You always saw the best in me, Sophie, even when I couldn't see it myself. Sophie found herself walking back to him, drawn by the pain in his voice. Tell me what happened with Lisa, the real story. James looked surprised by the sudden question, but he nodded slowly. She confessed her feelings for me at a board meeting, 3 months before you found us together. I rejected her immediately, told her I loved my wife, but I was a coward. I didn't want to lose her expertise, so I pretended everything could go back to normal. I should have fired her or stepped down myself. Instead, I just avoided dealing with it. Until that day I walked in. The day I realized my cowardice had cost me everything. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. Lisa tried to kiss me that day. I pushed her away, but you'd already seen enough. When you filed for divorce, I knew I deserved it. I'd failed you in so many ways. Why didn't you tell me this before? Would it have mattered? I'd already broken your trust in 1,000 other ways. Missing the hospital after, he swallowed hard. After we lost the baby. Working through every holiday, every anniversary. The Lisa thing was just the final straw, wasn't it? Sophie felt tears threatening and blinked them back. I needed you. Not your money, not your success. Just you. I know that now. He stood slowly. I should go. The board's calling an emergency meeting at midnight. Wait, Sophie surprised herself by catching his arm. When was the last time you ate? He thought for a moment. Breakfast, matey. Stay. I have leftover Chinese in the break room fridge. You shouldn't face a hostile takeover on an empty stomach. A real smile broke through his worried expression. You still take care of people, don't you? Old habits. She led him to the break room, trying to ignore how natural it felt to fall back into caring for him. But this doesn't mean anything, okay? I just don't want you passing out in your board meeting. Okay. But as she watched him devour cold noodles in her office break room, his tie undone and guard completely down, Sophie wondered if she was lying to herself again. Because this version of James, vulnerable, honest, and still fighting for what mattered, was far more dangerous to her heart than the workaholic she divorced had ever been. The downtown cafe was busy with the lunch rush when Sophie spotted Lisa Chen sitting at a corner table. 5 years had passed, but she recognized her ex-husband's former co-founder anywhere. The woman's sleek black hair was shorter now, and she traded her power suits for casual business wear, but her confident posture remained unchanged. Sophie's first instinct was to turn around and leave. She'd only stopped in for coffee before heading to an international client meeting. But Lisa had already seen her and was waving her over with a surprisingly warm smile. Sophie, Lisa stood as she approached. You look amazing. I've been following your firm's success. That sustainable shopping center you designed in Singapore is incredible. Sophie gripped her coffee cup tighter. Thank you. I heard you left Barrett Tech. 3 years ago. Lisa gestured to the empty chair across from her. Do you have a minute? There's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. Every instinct told Sophie to politely decline. But she found herself sitting down, curiosity winning over caution. If this is about James, it is. Liz's expression grew serious, but probably not in the way you think. I owe you an apology, Sophie, a big one. Sophie felt her chest tighten. For trying to kiss my husband. for letting you believe he had any interest in me. Lisa wrapped her hands around her teacup. I was in a bad place back then. My marriage had just ended, and I convinced myself James felt something for me, but he never did. Not once. I saw you together that day, Sophie said quietly, in the boardroom. You saw me making a fool of myself. Lisa's cheeks reddened with obvious embarrassment. I'd had too much champagne at the funding celebration. When I tried to kiss him, he pushed me away immediately. He told me he loved you, that he'd never betray you. Sophie stared at her coffee, processing this. Then why didn't he tell me that? Because I begged him not to. Lisa's voice cracked slightly. I was mortified, afraid it would ruin my reputation in the tech world if people knew I'd tried to kiss my married co-founder. James agreed to keep it quiet if I promised to keep things strictly professional from then on. But you didn't. No. I kept finding excuses to text him late at night, to touch his arm in meetings. I told myself I was just being friendly. Lisa looked down at her hands. When you filed for divorce, I thought maybe, but James shut me down completely. He said losing you was the wake-up call he needed, that he'd been a horrible husband, but he'd never cheated on you, emotionally or otherwise. Sophie remembered the pain of those days, the endless nights wondering if James had fallen for his brilliant co-founder. Why are you telling me this now? Because I saw the news about your firm designing Barrett Tech's new headquarters. Lisa met her eyes. I know James. He wouldn't have hired you just for your designs, amazing as they are. He's trying to show you he's changed. And before you decide anything about him, you deserve to know the truth. Which is? That James Barrett has exactly one great regret in his life, and it's not anything to do with business. Lisa pulled out her phone, scrolling through old photos. Look at this. The day you filed for divorce, he called an emergency board meeting. She handed Sophie her phone. The photo showed James standing at the head of the conference table, his face drawn with pain but determined. The date stamp confirmed it was the day Sophie's lawyer had delivered the divorce papers. He announced he was stepping down as CEO, Lisa continued. Said he needed to work on himself, to understand why he put success above love. The board convinced him to stay on with reduced responsibilities, but he was serious about changing. Started therapy, cut his hours, turned down deals that would have made the company billions because they didn't align with sustainable practices. Sophie handed the phone back, her hands shaking slightly. He never told me any of this. Of course not. He didn't do it for show. Lisa's voice softened. You know what he told me the day I left the company? He said he hoped I'd find someone who made me understand that real love isn't about ownership or conquest, that it's about becoming better people together. Just then, Sophie's phone buzzed. A message from her team. They'd won the international project they'd been pursuing for months. The biggest contract in her firm's history. 5 years ago, she would have called James first with news like this. I should go, she said, standing. I have a client meeting. Sophie? Lisa called as she turned to leave. The James you knew before? The workaholic who put success above everything. He died the day you left. The man he is now, he spent 5 years rebuilding himself from the ground up, just like you did. Sophie paused at the door. Why did you really leave Barrett Tech? Because every time I walked into that office, I was reminded of how I'd helped destroy something beautiful out of selfishness. Lisa smiled sadly. My company's doing well now, but success feels different when you've learned its true cost. Outside, the autumn sun warmed Sophie's face as she walked back to her office. Her phone buzzed again, her team wanting to celebrate the international contract. But her fingers found James's number instead. 5 years ago, she dreamed of success like this. Now she had it, but the first person she wanted to tell was still the same. Before she could overthink it, she typed, just won the Singapore project. Remember how we used to talk about designing buildings there? His reply came instantly. I remember everything we talked about. Congratulations, Sophie. You're changing the world, just like you always said you would. She smiled at her phone, feeling something shift in her heart. Maybe Lisa was right. Maybe they had both needed to rebuild themselves separately before they could think about building anything together again. The groundbreaking ceremony for Barrett Tech's new headquarters was scheduled for sunset. Sophie stood at the construction site, watching workers set up chairs and a small stage where James would give his speech. She had arrived early, needing time alone with the empty plot of land that would soon become her greatest achievement. The past week had been a whirlwind. James had successfully fought off the hostile takeover attempt, but not in his old aggressive style. Instead, he'd won by revealing Barrett Tech's 5-year plan for sustainable technology, including the revolutionary designs for this building. The press had eaten it up, and Global Tech's shareholders had backed down. "I thought I'd find you here." Diana's voice made her turn. Her best friend handed her a coffee and stood beside her, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "You okay?" Sophie took a sip of coffee, buying time before answering. "I finished reading his journal last night. All 5 years' worth. Every page." Sophie closed her eyes, remembering. "He wrote about everything, Diana. The day I left, the therapy sessions, the nights he couldn't sleep because he missed me. There's an entry from 2 years ago where he went to the hospital and sat in the same waiting room where we lost the baby. He wrote that he finally let himself feel the grief he'd been running from." Diana squeezed her hand. That must have been hard to read. It was like watching someone wake up from a long sleep. Sophie opened her eyes, looking at the construction site. "He wrote about changing Barrett Tech's whole mission after I left. About refusing deals that would have made him richer because they weren't environmentally responsible. He said he finally understood that all the money in the world meant nothing if you lost your soul getting it." "And do you believe him?" Before Sophie could answer, she spotted James arriving for the ceremony. He was talking with her design team, genuine enthusiasm on his face as Ryan showed him something on a tablet. The old James would have been checking his phone, only half listening. This one was fully present, asking questions, sharing the team's excitement. "The thing is," Sophie said slowly, "I've been watching him these past months. Not just with me, but with everyone. He learns the names of the cleaning staff, remembers details about people's lives. Last week, he rescheduled a board meeting because our junior designer's daughter had a school play." "People can change," Diana said softly. "Can they? Or do they just get better at pretending?" Sophie pulled James's journal from her bag. "There's an entry in here from the day he hired my firm. He wrote that even if I never forgave him, working with me would remind him every day of the man he should have been." "Sophie," Diana started, but Sophie kept going. "You know what scares me most? Not that he hasn't changed. I'm scared because I think he really has, and..." She took a shaky breath. "And I'm falling in love with who he's become. But what if I'm wrong? What if I trust him again and he goes back to being that workaholic who forgot I existed? Have you talked to him about this?" "How can I? Everything's so complicated now. The project, our professional relationship." There he is. A new voice interrupted them. Amy, Sophie's assistant, hurried over. "Mr. Barrett, they need you for the press photos before the ceremony." James nodded to Amy but turned to Sophie first. "I was hoping to catch you before things got busy. Do you have a minute?" Diana squeezed Sophie's arm and walked away, leaving them alone in the fading sunlight. James looked nervous, so different from the confident CEO the press would soon photograph. "I have something for you," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "Before you decide anything about us, about whether there could ever be an us again, you should see this." Sophie opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter, his resignation as CEO of Barrett Tech. "James, what is this?" "I'm stepping down after the headquarters is completed. The board knows, they're announcing it tonight." He ran a hand through his hair. "I'm starting a new foundation focused on sustainable technology for developing nations. Smaller scale, more hands-on work, but Barrett Tech is your life." "No." He took a step closer. "It was my excuse for not living, for not being there when you needed me. I won't make that mistake again. I don't understand. Why would you walk away from everything you built? Because I finally understand what really matters." He gestured to the construction site. "This building, Sophie, it's not just about sustainable architecture. It's about legacy. About building something that helps the world instead of just making profit. You taught me that even when I was too blind to see it." Sophie stared at the resignation letter, her heart pounding. "And if I still can't trust you?" "Then I'll still step down. This isn't about winning you back. It's about finally becoming the man I should have been all along. He touched her hand gently. The man who would have held you at the hospital instead of checking his phone. The man who would have treasured every moment with you instead of chasing the next deal. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the event coordinator. The ceremony was about to begin. James had to give his speech, to smile for the cameras, and play his role one last time as CEO. "Think about it," he said softly. "Not about us, but about who we've both become. Sometimes the hardest part of growing isn't changing, it's accepting that others have changed too." He walked away toward the stage, leaving Sophie holding his resignation letter and feeling like she was standing on the edge of something much bigger than a groundbreaking ceremony. In her bag, his journal seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, 5 years of transformation captured in ink and paper. The sun finally set, string lights flickering on around the construction site. As James took the stage to announce both the building's future and his own new path, Sophie realized that sometimes love was like sustainable architecture. It wasn't about building something that looked perfect from the outside, but about creating something strong enough to weather any storm, humble enough to work with nature instead of against it, and brave enough to break old patterns in search of something better. 1 year later, Sophie stood in the completed Barrett Tech headquarters, watching the sunset through the living walls she'd designed. The building had exceeded every expectation. It generated more clean energy than it used. Its gardens provided fresh produce for local food banks, and its design had already inspired dozens of companies to embrace sustainable architecture. "The plants are thriving better than expected," James said, joining her by the window. He'd kept his promise. Tomorrow would be his last day as CEO. The foundation he'd created was already funding sustainable technology projects in 3 countries. "The maintenance team has been amazing," Sophie replied, touching a leaf gently. "Remember how everyone said living walls wouldn't work in a corporate setting? You proved them wrong." He smiled, but she could see the nervousness behind it. "Speaking of proving people wrong, have you thought about what we discussed last week?" Sophie turned to face him fully. They'd been dating again for 6 months, taking things slowly, rebuilding trust one day at a time. Last week, over dinner in the rooftop garden she'd designed, he'd asked her to marry him again. "I have." She took his hand, leading him to her favorite spot in the building, a quiet corner where the afternoon light created patterns through the plants. "I need to show you something first." She pulled out her phone, opening her photos. "This is from last month when you had that fever." The picture showed James asleep on her couch, a half-finished bowl of soup beside him. "You had 3 important meetings that day, but you let your deputy handle them because the doctor said you needed rest." She swiped to another photo. James playing basketball with Ryan's kids at the company picnic. Another swipe. James helping her mother carry groceries, laughing at something she'd said. "The old you would have been too busy for any of this." "The old me was an idiot," he said softly. "Maybe, but this new you." She put her phone away, taking both his hands in hers. "The man who stops meetings to watch birds nest in the living walls, who actually uses his vacation days, who came with me to grief counseling so we could finally heal together from losing our baby. That's the man I want to marry." His eyes widened. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes with conditions." She tried to look stern but couldn't help smiling. "First, we're having the wedding here, in this building we created together. Second, we're writing our own vows, and they have to include a sustainability clause." James laughed, pulling her close. "Done. Any other conditions?" "Yes." She touched his face gently. "Promise me we'll never stop growing. That we'll keep building something beautiful together, even when it's hard." "I promise." He kissed her softly. "Though I should warn you, I've already started a journal for our future kids, telling them how their mom changed the world one building at a time." Sophie felt tears threatening. "Future kids? If you want them, when you're ready." He wiped a tear from her cheek. "We'll do everything differently this time. I'll be there for every moment, every doctor's appointment, every middle-of-the-night craving. Even if it means missing board meetings. I already resigned from 3 boards." He grinned at her surprise. "The foundation is enough. I want time to watch our family grow, to be present for all the small moments I missed before." Sophie looked around the space they'd created together. Her designs brought to life through his trust in her vision. The building hummed with life, from the plants growing on its walls to the people working inside, all part of something bigger than themselves. "You know what I love most about this building?" she said, leading him toward the rooftop garden where they'd have their wedding. "It's not just sustainable, it's resilient. It can adapt to changing weather, heal itself when damaged, grow stronger over time." "Like us?" James squeezed her hand. "Like us." She stopped at the garden's edge, where their vegetables grew alongside flowers. The old James and Sophie couldn't make it work, but maybe we needed to fall apart to grow into people who could build something lasting. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in colors that reflected off the building's solar panels. Below them, the city stretched out, already dotted with other buildings following their sustainable design. They'd changed more than just their own lives. They'd started a movement. "I love you," James said simply. "Not because you're brilliant or successful or changing the world, though you are all those things. I love you because you taught me that real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about how you choose to rebuild." Sophie leaned into him, watching the stars appear above their garden. Tomorrow, James would step down as CEO. Next month, they'd get married right here, surrounded by the living proof that broken things could become beautiful again. And someday, their children would play in this garden, learning that love, like nature, could heal and grow if you gave it the right conditions to thrive. "We should go," she said finally. "Diana's throwing us that engagement dinner, remember?" "One more minute." James wrapped his arms around her. "I just want to remember this moment, standing here with you at the end of one chapter and the beginning of another." Sophie smiled, thinking of the small secret she'd share with him at dinner, the positive pregnancy test she'd taken that morning. Their new chapter was starting sooner than he knew, and this time, everything would be different. Because this time, they'd learned that the grandest buildings and biggest bank accounts meant nothing without love. That true success wasn't measured in dollars, but in moments shared, in trust rebuilt, and in the courage to try again after failure. As they walked hand in hand toward their future, the sustainable heart of their building kept beating, processing clean air, generating renewable energy, growing food for those in need. Like their love, it had become something that would last, something that made the world a little better just by existing. And really, isn't that the greatest success story of all?